I always debate whether that clock is right. I make it 2 minutes to go, yes. Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I'm welcoming in your name? This evening, just before we go to the formal business of the meeting, I have 2 announcements. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Memoria Lewis, who is our interim Chief Executive and General Secretary, who will be attending meetings for the next few months. Welcome to you, and I hope fellows will get the opportunity to chat to you afterwards. The second thing I would like to do, those of you who read this week's salon will be aware that our former president, Professor Dame Rosemary Cramp, died actually on the day of our anniversary meeting on the 27th of April. Rosemary was a very important person in the history and development of this society, fellow since the 1950s, and someone who did an immense amount for our subjects. I wonder whether you would be wish you to stand for a few moments silence just to remember Rosemary. Thank you. Knowing Rosemary well as I did, I know that she would want us to have a drink to at the reception later and to enjoy ourselves this evening. Minutes.
Wonderful. Society of Antiquaries of London Anniversary Meeting. Thursday, the 27th of April, 2023 at 5 p.m. Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millet, President in the chair, the minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of 20 April 2023 were read and signed. The President expressed his thanks to the retiring treasurer, Mr. Stephen Dunmore, and 2 retiring council members, Professor John Hines and Ms. Natalie Cohen. Since the ballots for treasurer and 2 ordinary members of council were uncontested, the President declared elected for 23-26 treasurer, Dr. Carol Bell, and ordinary members of council, Dr. Elizabeth Hallam Smith, and Ms. Shahina Farid. The President announced that following the ballot, which closed earlier that day, the following were elected fellows of the Society of Antiquaries: Anne French, Brenna Hassett, Alexander Herrera Valiskowski, Brian Hoggard, Laurie Johnson, Alexandra Macon, Alan H. Nelson, Michael Tolmache, Angus Vine, Michael Werner, and the following being in attendance, having signed the obligation required by the statute, was duly admitted as fellow. Hooray. The meeting approved the appointment of Moore Kingston Smith, LLP, as the Society's auditors for 2023-24, The president read out a list of names of fellows deceased since the last anniversary meeting. The president thanked benefactors to the society in 2023. The president awarded a gold medal to Professor Richard Bradley. The treasurer presented his annual financial statement. The president then gave his anniversary address. On the motion of Stephen Dunmore, treasurer, the following resolution was carried: that the thanks of the meeting be returned to the president for his address and that he be requested to allow it to be published. The president signified his assent. The meeting was adjourned at 6 p.m. and was followed by a reception.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a miscellany of papers. What we'll do this evening is we have three papers. I will introduce each speaker in the paper, and we'll go from one to the other, and then have questions and discussion at the end. It will make taking questions easier with microphones and so forth. I hope that suits everyone. Our first paper, our first speaker is Anna Kay, who's going to talk to us on the Lestranges of Constantin, Norfolk, and the life in the English Republic. Anna, from 1996 to 2002, curator of historic royal palaces, which looks after the Tower of London, Hampton Court, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, and Bankton Hall and Whitehall. From 2002 to 2012, she was properties presentation and curatorial director of English Heritage. She has since then, since 2012, been the director of the Landmark Trust. So we welcome Anna to talk to us this evening.
I'm going to stand here because I'm only 5'2" and I don't think I can see over the monitor otherwise. I hope that's not going to interfere with the broadcasting. Thank you very much. Well, while this is coming down, I'm so excited about talking here this evening, but I actually turned up yesterday and discovered there was no one here. So I'm glad that I came a day early rather than a day late. And I actually think my very first ever paper that I gave, or thing in that ilk, was a Society of Antiquaries Miscellany in about 1996, where Edward Impey introduced me, or whatever the form was, when I was working on the Society's wonderful copy of the lost Elizabethan plan of the Tower of London, the Herod and Gascoigne plan. So it's very nice to be here. This evening I'm going to talk to you about the Lestranges of Constantin Hall, and this comes from work that went into a book that I published last year, which is there about the 1650s, and it was born, the book and what I'm going to talk about, it's born from a desire to understand better what it was like to live through those extraordinary years and what it was like to live through them if you weren't at the centre of things. Those people who weren't part of the kind of hotbed of politics here in London and Westminster, but who nonetheless saw the world around them change so much, and to get a sense of that experience. So I'm going to try and say something about that using this particular family as my case study. So I'm going to transport you to a lovely part of the world that I'm sure many of you know well, North Norfolk, the corner of the county where the Wash kind of breaks from the coastline. The Lestranges were a Norman family, been there since soon after the conquest, and were headed up by Hammond Lestrange, who you see here. Excellent hairstyle. Hammond Lestrange, Baronet, and his wife Alice. They were figures in a way of an earlier age. They were married in the last year of Elizabeth I's reign, and were in their 60s when we get to the period that I'm going to be talking about here this evening. We're, of course, in the period of just post the Civil War. The kind of conflict had, of course, raged during the 1640s, and I'm going to pick up at the end of that. Clear in our minds, of course, that the Civil War was never a war between Republicans and Royalists, but very much between people with different views about what form of religion should pertain in the nation and the kind of extent of royal authority. The Lestranges were Royalists, not of a very kind of deep-set variety, but when the war came to this part of Norfolk, Hamon Lestrange was the commander of the force which defended King's Lynn during the siege of 1643, one of the earliest sieges of the Civil War, facing across the ramparts, part of which still survives today, this is South Gate, the young Oliver Cromwell, who was at that point quite a junior officer in the opposing army. The siege was lost, and the Lestranges, like so many who fought on the side of the king when that happened, retreated to their estates. Now, there are the three generations which concern us here. So Hamon and Alice, who we saw the picture of there, and their children, Nicholas, Hamon, and Elizabeth, and Roger, and their grandchildren, which we see on the bottom row there. Interestingly, as was so often the case within families, they weren't all on the same side in the Civil War. I was writing this in the run-up to Brexit, and there were many parallels that struck me. But anyway, Sir Hamon and his second son, also called Hamon, and his younger son, Roger, were all on the Royalist side. Nicholas didn't take either side, claimed he didn't have enough forces to contribute to the defense of the county, and so he was going to sit it out. And their son-in-law, Sir William Spring, big figure, big cloth merchant of Lavenham, was a parliamentarian. So we can see within an individual family how loyalties fell in different ways among people who remained close throughout. Roger Lestrange, who we see here on the right, lived in London. The rest of the family were firmly Norfolk figures. The generation, the second tier generation there, Nicholas, who I said didn't have the horses, we see here with his wife, and they lived with his parents at Hunstanton Hall, which still stands. It's a very handsome house, now divided into flats in the centre of estates, which still belong to the Lestrange family. Nice interior shots from country life. Very interesting architecturally, which I haven't got time to talk about now, but additions made in the mid-17th century by Hamon and Alice Lestrange we see there, including this fascinating octagonal building in the landscape, which has, to my knowledge, never been written up. Very interesting. Now, the reason that this family is very interesting to look at is because of the archives that survives for them. In the Norfolk Record Office, there's an absolutely astonishing cache of account books, inventories, correspondence, memoirs, or memorials, that allow us to get immensely close to the day-to-day, almost hour-to-hour experience in some respects of this family. And I just want to note the really wonderful work done on this archive by Elizabeth Griffiths and Jane Whittle, published by the Norfolk Record Society, is a brilliant resource, but the material outstrips even their wonderful publications and gives us the ability to trace what it was like, the life that they lived during these years. Now, the Lestranges, like so many royalists, suffered financially from their participation in the Civil War, as well as having their estates sequestered and then having to pay the composition fines to regain them, which was the usual kind of formulation. They had an additional lot of financial burdens. First of all, during the course of the siege of King's Lynn, their estates were ransacked and lots of livestock was taken and damage done. But also a special arrangement was secured by their opponents after the siege of King's Lynn that required the Lestranges to pay for the repairs to the town that were necessary following the conflict. So this involved the cost of rebuilding town walls, many other things besides, and included the cost of rebuilding the almshouses in Gaywood, which is a suburb of the town, which had been burnt down during the course of the fighting. So this is the new lot of almshouses built in 1649, which Alice Lestrange had to pay for. They're incredibly indignant about this because the lists of things which people came forward with as destruction that happened during the siege, sort of never ending, and it clearly involved lots of things that were nothing to do with the siege. But anyway, that's the sort of financial, that was the financial impact. Come 1651, after the Battle of Worcester had been fought and lost by the Royalists, the Act of General Pardon and Oblivion was passed, which signified the drawing of a line under the conflicts of the Civil War, and which declared that healing and settling was now the priority of the nation, and that no longer would, the badge of Cavalier and Roundhead be used. These would be things forgotten. And it seems that the Lestranges took this to heart, and in 1651, April 1650, they signed, the men of the family signed the engagement, which was the oath of loyalty to the new regime that adult men were required to take, and they did this without protest. And they took no part in the Charles II's attempt to retake the kingdom that ended in the Battle of Worcester. So they seem to have kind of decided, like I think a lot of people, that whether or not they liked it, the reality of the new regime was something that they were going to accept rather than to fight. In 1653, of course, the Commonwealth period of the interregnum ended, and the Protectorate came into being, the sort of mixed constitution where sovereignty was shared between the House of Commons and the Lord Protector. The Lestranges received a copy in their library of the published version of the new constitution, the instrument of government, which we see there, and added it to the books on their shelves. And it's interesting at this point to step back and try to take stock of what was the reality of this regime for them, based as they were in Norfolk and at really considerable remove from the sort of hotbed politics of London. Religion was clearly a sort of sphere in which much had changed. Obviously, the reforms of the innovations of the pre-Civil War period under Archbishop Laud and Charles I had been swept away, and the scope was now given for some degree of free worship for various nonconformist groups, including the Baptists. The Quakers had come into being, and this engraving, although satire, gives us a bit of a flavour of the kind of informality of some of these nonconformist meetings. But although there was, to an extent, a greater range of sort of religious freedom allowed, the Book of Common Prayer had completely gone, the episcopacy had gone, of course, and the Church of England was very much changed institutionally from the creature it had been before the Civil War. But interestingly, when you look at the reality of that in the locality, the change is less distinct. So for the parishes around Hunstanton, the four main parishes that the Lestranges were involved in, the person who was the vicar or the minister for each one of those parish churches remained the same from 1630 to 1660. So although there had been these tremendous changes in the sort of rubric and the liturgy and the structures of the church, actually, if you were going to church on Sunday in Hunstanton or in Ringstead or any of the other local churches, it was the same person at the front presiding. And the continuity of that, I would suggest, is often underrated when you look at, compared to the kind of picture of very stark change, which is often given by the sort of Westminster edicts. Churches themselves, of course, had become greatly simplified following the changes. The removal of the Book of Common Prayer, the institution instead of the Westminster Directory or the Directory of Worship, absolutely focused on the Sabbath and the sort of word of the Bible and the removal of a lot of the sort of liturgical additions of the later Middle Ages was something which obviously changed the feeling of these spaces. And I think this building is a very interesting case in point, which is Guyhan Chapel, built right at the end of the 1650s in Cambridgeshire, very identifiably still a church, clearly the arrangement at the East End, not that which would have been there in 1650, but nonetheless giving a sense of what that must have looked like. Obviously, with the Book of Common Prayer being removed, the church festivals of the old calendar had gone. So famously, of course, Christmas, but also the celebration of Whitsun and Easter and Michaelmas and all these other church festivals. But it is interesting that, again, the picture given by the Hunstanton Hall accounts makes completely clear that it was one thing to remove the use of churches on religious feast days for particular religious activities. It was another thing completely to remove the celebration of these events and moments within the household. And so we can see in the Hunstanton Hall accounts that fiddlers are paid to come and play. There's obviously giving of presents. There's cooking of plum pies and venison and kind of Christmas fare. There was dancing, there was card playing, all the kind of Christmassy things that you might have expected, still very familiar today, were absolutely going on right the way through the 1650s. So it was all very well for somebody in London to say that this festival had ceased. The reality on the ground was completely different. It's also very interesting on that point about reconciliation to note that the Hunstanton Hall accounts also show the gift giving that happened. And very soon after the Act of Oblivion was passed and the engagement was signed by the family, you can see that the giving of gifts to people who had fought on the other side is happening. So Valentine Walton, for example, who was Oliver Cromwell's brother-in-law and who was put into the position of being sort of senior government figure in King's Lynn, the local town, absolutely, obviously, a kind of paid up member of this Republican regime, is being sent venison at Christmas by the Lestranges of Hunstanton Hall, regardless of those old loyalties. The main wine merchant in the town, Robert Thorogood, who was another very kind of committed parliamentarian and then member of the sort of Commonwealth regime, was sending 3 bottles of wine to the Lestranges of Hunstanton. So we can see that all those kind of webs of local relationships, the need to stay in with the people in command locally, to curry favor with your significant people in the locality, began to weave back together, bind back together people who had been on different sides. There was no abating of shopping and conspicuous consumption, and the accounts are wonderful on the expenditure, again, quite often upturning, kind of increasing at points of traditional festivals like Christmas. Hammond Lestrange ordered a wonderful red silk Spanish suit for Christmas of 1653, which we can imagine him wearing on one of these very jolly evenings. Furs, glass, plate, all sorts of things are being bought, and even though they've got heavy fines to pay and so on, the life of a kind of county family like this is going on. And internationalism, it's so interesting. The accounts give a great picture of how much is coming to this quite obscure part of North Norfolk from the further parts of the globe, whether it's in food, in spices, ginger, figs, all manner of sort of flavorings and so on, condiments. But also Hammond Lestrange was a great amateur scientist, and there are all sorts of obscure unctions and things that he was getting through his neighbor who he worked with from as far away as South Asia. And it's just so interesting to think of this painting, which I'm sure is then well known to you all, the Paston Treasure, painted of the collection of a Norfolk gentleman, painted in 1660s. I think still a bit there's still a question mark about exactly when, but this is not a collection someone's going to have got together in 5 minutes. It's clearly being accumulated during the previous decades, and this sort of astonishing cornucopia of things from around the world, including, of course, this young African man who we can see here in the background. And there was living at Hunstanton Hall in the early 17th century, an Ethiopian boy mentioned in the accounts. We don't know in what capacity, but again, it gives us a flavour of any sense you might have that England in the 1650s was an insular place, I think is something this helps us to challenge. And of course, it was in 1657 that the East India Company was granted a new charter and monopoly, and the explosion of international trade going on was very much kind of manifested itself in things in the lives of these people here in Norfolk. The Lestranges were an incredibly musical family, had close links with a series of contemporary musicians, played the viols. All the men in my family tree were great viol players. And they had a chamber organ, which you see here, which is now in America, in a church in Virginia. It was sold, but gives us a sense of the sort of richness of the sounds, if you like, of this period. And there was a Roger Lestrange, the younger brother who I've mentioned, who was sort of the black sheep of the family, was in London and was joining in with a group playing the viols in Whitehall Palace in the mid-1650s when Oliver Cromwell walked past, and he records him stopping in the doorway. As we know, Cromwell was a great lover of music, to listen to the musicians playing, of whom he was a number. So it was a family with this very strong music tradition. And it was also a family with a tremendous sense of humor. And I think one of the great tonics to the sort of traditional kind of caricature of this as a period of bleak austerity is another thing, which is part of the collection of material from the Lestranges, although it's actually in the British Library, not in Norfolk, which is the Lestrange Family joke book, which is a most wonderful thing. It's called Merry Passages and Jests, I think. And it's a collection of anecdotes written down by Nicholas Lestrange, so the second generation, chap with the thin face, recording all the funny stories that were told in the house, each one numbered, and each one ascribing who in the family had told it. And they're brilliant. I mean, some of them are really, really unfunny. Some are absolutely hilarious. And they're ribald, and they're full of stories of sort of, Dutch drainage engineers getting terribly drunk in Norwich, and then an incident with a prostitute, and, it's funny stories told in the pub, and old ladies making indiscreet comments, family weddings, and all sorts of things. And they're brought together in this book. And it is a brilliant foil to that sense that, this period was one in which, the only sort of the bleak restraint was to the fore. It also includes lots of funny stories about people of different religious persuasions on both sides, sending them up. And I think we quite often forget about the fact that people in the past found the serious things around them as well as serious, found them funny. And this is a brilliant window into that. They were bibliophiles, and the kind of breadth of their collecting and interests are shown by the fact that there was 4 copies of Icon Basilica in the library, but also a whole range of Puritan works by John Lilburne and others. And Hammond Lestrange, the second Hammond, the second son of Alice and Sir Hammond, published this book in the 1650s, which is a biography of Charles I, amazingly, published, written with a sort of deliberate positioning in the preface to try to give a balanced account of somebody who wasn't all good and wasn't all bad. Very interesting for an age full of extremes, attempt to try to find a more nuanced account of the events in such recent memory. If all of this had carried on like this, I think that the story of this period might have been very different. But of course, it's well known that it didn't. And the failure of the Republican government's attempt to try and seize the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean in 1655 was a crushing blow to Oliver Cromwell and his colleagues, and combined with the discovery of a royalist plot, which was foiled, but nonetheless shook the regime, was the thing that led to the institution of the Major General's regime. Got here a picture in your collection. I'm not quite sure where it hangs, actually. You will all know, but of Charles Fleetwood, Oliver Cromwell's son-in-law, who was one of the Major Generals appointed to institute greater moral reform of the nation and to prevent any further royalist uprisings. A militia based in each territory of the of the country, and heavily armed and staffed with new soldiers, to be paid for by a new tax to be levied on former royalists and Catholics. And of course, at a stroke, the idea that you would no longer know who had fought for who, that the loyalties of the Civil War would be forgotten, was brought to a halt, because this heavy taxing of royalists and the ability of the militia to dig them out of bed at night, to extract bonds for good behavior and so on, was a source of great indignation to people locally, regardless of which side they fought on, as a terrible imposition of the sort of center, if you like, on the lives of the locality. And one of the things that's very strong in all of these materials is the great power of the locality. There's a wonderful, among the sort of funny sayings in the jest book, Alice Lestrange was recorded as saying that London would be a marvelous, sweet, fine place if only it stood in the country. And I think, you know, again, the strength of local identity and the dislike of imposition from outside is a very clear dynamic in this period. And it was made much, you know, even more so present in the lives of people, not just the Major General's regime itself, but this great infrastructure that was put in place to kind of oversee and to kind of have surveillance of the actions of royalists. So everyone who was marked down as a royalist, if they left the county, they were to tell the local officer where they were going. Whether if they came to London, they had to say where they were staying, and it was recorded in a series of books that are in the British Library. You see one of them here. You know, a really real sort of surveillance state arrangement for former royalists, which again caused enormous indignation among the people of Norfolk, as it did in other areas of the country. It all, of course, came unraveled as a regime after Oliver Cromwell's death, and in 1660, of course, we have the restoration of the monarchy. The thing, though, I think this material is really revealing of is, as I say, the extent to which relationships and kind of loyalties in the mid-1650s had healed a great deal after the conflict of the Civil War, but the experience of the Major General's regime, the surveillance that came with it, the ability of an outside militia to come and interfere with your life really turned people against the regime, and you know, would be very much to the fore when it came to discussions in Parliament in 1659-60 about whether or not the Republic should continue. And it's very telling that the younger son of the Lestrange family, Roger Lestrange, who I mentioned, at the Restoration, would become an absolutely tireless sort of mouthpiece for the indignation of royalists at their treatment during the Civil War, and a kind of salt in the wound of the attempts by Charles II and others in 1660 to try and bring about some sort of national reconciliation. And he became a pamphleteer, famous pamphleteer, whose many publications are part of the British Library collection, endlessly pointing out the iniquities of the behavior of the Republicans during the 1650s, and to preventing, if you like, a deeper or quicker reconciliation than might otherwise have happened between the warring parties. I'll just end on his description of what the experience was of the Major General's regime in the life of the Lestranges. He wrote that by an order of the 24th of November, 1655, no cavalier must be allowed so much as the least piece of defensive arms, no person suffered to keep in his house as chaplain or schoolmaster, any sequestered or ejected minister, nor any person of that quality must be permitted to teach at a school, either public or private, or preach, but in his own family, nor administer the sacrament, nor marry, nor use the Book of Common Prayer. And I think this indignation was something which would have a really significant impact on life in England after the Restoration. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Anna. That's gives a real granular insight into life in that exceptional decade. Our second speaker this evening is Jonathan Healy, who's Associate Professor in Social History at the University of Oxford, where he teaches local and social history in the Department of Continuing Education. The Blazing World, his history of 17th century England, is now out from Bloomsbury. And his paper is Alice the Adamite, Penelope Punk, an unusually riotous history of the English Revolution. Fantastic title. So over to you.
Thank you very much. It is strange to note how we have been insensibly slid into this beginning of a civil war by one unexpected accident after another as waves of the sea. We scarce know how, but from paper combats, we are now come to the question of raising forces and naming a general and officers of our army. These are the words in 1642 of this man, Sir Bulstrode Whitlock, one of those curious 17th century characters with a very significant place in the story of the century, but also a very, very funny name. Whitlock was a lawyer. He'd been involved in the trial of the Earl of Strafford in 1641, and he was horrified by 1642 that the political crisis that had started in 1640 with the calling of the Long Parliament had descended like waves upon the sea into a full-blooded military combat. One of the interesting things that he says here is that he talks about paper combats. He talks about how it started off as a war of words, a war of publications, arguments in the press, and inevitably it then developed into something much more serious. The point of my paper today is to think about how the Civil War started, why it started. Why did the Civil War begin in 1642? Why were there two sides? What was the cause of this great conflict that we've heard about the aftermath of in Anna's brilliant paper just a second ago? Well, happily, people who lived at the time had views about what the causes of the conflict were. Unhappily, they had very, very different views. Two people who were right at the center of it, or at least new people who were right at the center of it, were Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Hobbes. Oliver Cromwell, after the Civil War, said that religion was not the thing at first contested for. He thought it was to do with constitutional issues. Unfortunately, Thomas Hobbes took completely the opposite view. The cause of the Civil War was nothing other than the quarreling about theological issues. And that debate between religion versus the Constitution has carried forward into the debate amongst historians right up to the start of the 21st century. One particular contributor to that debate, who is the head of the Oliver Cromwell Association, ironically taking a very different view to Cromwell himself, saying that religion was indeed the first thing contested for. In fact, this was not the first great European revolution. Instead, it was Europe's last wars of religion. People at the time had views about why the conflicts had happened. One of them was one of the most oft quoted views was from a parliamentarian, a gentlewoman called Lady Elizabeth Felton, who I wasn't able to find a painting of. There's a famous Lady Felton who lived later, but this is her grandmother. But she did live here at Playford Hall in Suffolk. And she said that the Civil War was about faith, but it was also, interestingly enough, it was about what we might call, slightly mischievously, class. She described why people picked a particular side in 1642, and she was keen to emphasize that it was about religiosity. It was about how much faith people had. She took the view that the parliamentarians, the side most likely to be supported by Puritans, were the more religious amongst the community. Her view was supported by people who believed that royalists were those who sort of danced away on Sundays, whereas parliamentarians tended to be those who went to church and then went home and prayed at home as they should have done on the Sabbath. But it's the reference to social structure, social status that I think is most interesting about what she said. The most religious and conscientious men, gendered language, of course, amongst the nobility, gentry, and commonalty supported Parliament. And it's that bit, the and commonality bit, which I want to focus on a little bit today. Because we are always told in a sort of post-Marxist world that the Civil War was not a class war. And I'm not going to argue that it was, because it wasn't. But what I am going to suggest is that questions about the distribution of power and the proper distribution of power became central to the dividing lines that Bulstrode Whitlock was talking about in 1642. And in order to argue that, I'm going to go back to when the whole thing starts, 1640. In fact, a specific date, November the 3rd, 1640, the first sitting of what became the Long Parliament. And on that day, the lady in the middle, who I'm sure some of you will recognise, Lucy Hay, the Countess of Carlisle, one of the sort of great courtiers under Charles I. She went into Parliament and she listened to the speech given by the Lord Keeper. It was tradition for the King or Queen to give a speech at the start of Parliament, but usually by this point that role had been passed on to the Lord Chancellor or the Lord Keeper. In this case, it was given by the Lord Keeper. She described it as the worst speech she had ever heard. The reason it was such a bad speech is that in November 1640, almost everyone in the sort of, in Parliament in particular, and in the political nation more widely, is clamouring for reform. They realised that Charles I's government had gone badly wrong, that his authoritarian regime in terms of religion, the dodgy behaviour with the instigation of ship money, which of course historians now argue was completely legal, but people at the time actually that was part of the problem. The problem was it had been declared legal, and therefore they thought that the law needed changing. The sort of over zealous prosecution of Puritan martyrs like Prynne, Burton, and Bastwick. All of this was high on the reform agenda in November 1640. And there was a sort of general belief amongst most of the people in the Long Parliament that the basic kind of organs of Charles I's personal rule needed to be dismantled. And dismantled they were. And Lucy Hay, who is one of the sort of great kind of characters of this age, had a sort of really interesting kind of role in this, in that at this time she had a very kind of intense platonic friendship with the Earl of Strafford, who was the sort of leading minister of Charles I and probably the most hated man in England, give or take William Laud, in November 1640. And one of the first things that the Long Parliament did was they had him arrested and eventually put on trial, around about which point she transferred her affections to this man here, the rather serious Puritan John Pym. Now, Pym was a veteran of the parliamentarian reformist cause. He had sat in the 1620s Parliament, where he had been a member of the opposition. He was notoriously humorless, although he did score the biggest laugh in the 1629 Parliament when discussing a bill for adultery, against adultery. He made the procedural motion at the end of the debate that we commit it, meaning we commit the bill. Notoriously humorous, he was an incredibly adept political manipulator. And with a kind of group of noble and MP fellow travellers, people like the Earl of Bedford, the Earl of Warwick, people like Lord Mandeville, all these kind of big political figures, By the early months of 1641, they had successfully imposed a triennial act on Charles I, whereby Parliament must be called at least once every 3 years. And by the spring of 1641, they had successfully put the Earl of Strafford on trial, had him executed. And by the summer of 1641, they had successfully dismantled much of the machinery of Charles I's personal rule. They had abolished the Court of Chamber, they had abolished the Court of High Commission, William Laud was in prison. So all was going very, very well. Not much chance for a civil war. Essentially, there is a reform which is going on, and the king is basically just having to take it. He hasn't got any option at the moment. He doesn't have much support. Very dramatically, over the next 12 months, that situation changed. And the question of why that changed, why it was that there was an emergence in Parliament and outside Parliament of royalism, a royalist party, a moderate party. Why that happened is one of the most important causes of the Civil War, because you need two sides to fight a civil war. So the rest of my talk is going to be about why that happened. This is Henry Burton. You may remember him as one of the Puritan trilogy, Prynne, Burton and Bastwick. He is a Yorkshireman. He's from near York. He thinks that he grew up in a backwater. I think he's got a slightly sort of, a chippy kind of face. He sort of looks like the kind of person you'd expect to find running the supporters club at Leeds United, as a sort of, very angry at the management of the board and the team. He was once the chaplain to the royal family, but he drastically fell out of favour in the 1620s when the church moved along more Arminian, Laudian lines, and he found himself left behind. He was also a prolific printer, and after the before the Long Parliament even sat, he was probably responsible for a very radical text called England's Complaint to Jesus Christ, really kind of taking the appeals process to the highest level. And this was published anonymously, very wisely, in the summer of 1640. And what it did was it tackled the religious reforms of William Laud and thought about what they meant for the distribution of power, what they meant for the relationship between the people and the crown. And there was one particular passage which caused a particular stir in England's complaint. And it's this bit, I'm going to read it. It says, "If a king maintain a faction about him, which go about to oppress his whole kingdom and people in their laws and liberties, and most of all in the true religion, so as he will not rule them by the good laws of the kingdom, but seeks to make all his subjects slaves by bringing their souls, bodies, estates under a miserable bondage, is it not now high time for the whole state either to labour to heal the breach, or if necessity, where there is no other remedy, to stand up as one man and to defend themselves and their country till the faction shall be utterly cashiered, and so the king reform himself and renew the covenant and conditions of the kingdom to the good and just satisfaction of the people." The good and just satisfaction of the people. It is quietly, although I think, I don't think he would have wanted it to be read quietly. He would have wanted it to be, thundered from the pulpit. It's quietly a very radical suggestion, which is that if the king is going against religion, the people should rise up against the king, and they should challenge him. Resistance, crown. Now, in 1640 and 1641, there was an efflorescence in pamphleteering. And you can see it, there's a wonderful graph of the amount of surviving stuff that we have from this period. And there's basically sort of 800 tracts which survive from sort of 1639. And then by 1641, it's 4,000. It's incredible. There's stuff coming out every week, loads of this stuff. And it's like Burton's pamphlet. It engages with questions about church government. And of course, this is partly kicked off by the debate about root and branch. You can sort of tell people's generation by what you mean by when you talk about R&B. The young people talk about rhythm and bass. Older people talk about rhythm and blues. I talk about root and branch, the root and branch petition, reform of the episcopacy. And these debates, they played into questions about not just church government, but also government more generally. What's the relationship between the crown and the people? And by late 1641, there are some very, very strange things being said. One of the most striking is this text here: the justification of the independent churches of Christ, being an answer to Mr. Edwards, that's Thomas Edwards of Gangrena fame. And this is an argument for independent congregationalism, basically, not separatism from the church, but people coming together and deciding how they receive their faith within their church community. This was something which was gradually becoming more and more common in 1641, and people were, sort of moderates were horrified by it. But what's the other thing about this justification of the independent churches of Christ? Who is it written by? Catherine Chidley. Written by a woman. The horror, the absolute horror. Catherine Chidley was right at the center of the sort of Baptist and what eventually would become the kind of leveller radical movement in London. And she was, so she's writing against a guy called Thomas Edwards, who's this kind of, he's a parliamentarian, but he's one of the sort of more sort of stuffy ones. And you can imagine him being horrified. Not only has this someone written this denunciation of his religious point of view, but also it's coming from a woman, and not a particularly wealthy woman as well. So one of the things that's happening in 1641 is that as part of this political breakdown, as part of this growth in the press, particularly in London, lots of people are starting to have new ideas. They are starting to have potentially radical and potentially dangerous ideas. This is very worrying. Now, to start off with, we talked about religion versus the constitution. And I think one of the things that's really important to emphasize is that a lot of this debate in this point is like Catherine Chidley, it's about religion. But it also plays on some very, very real fears amongst the people sitting in the Long Parliament. I was reading a piece by Hugh Trevor Roper, who is if we can forgive the nasty business about the Hitler diaries, is still a kind of wonderful historian. I mean, I think he's wrong about an awful lot of stuff, but he's still a wonderful historian to read. And he describes the MPs in the Long Parliament as dim squires. Now, I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. I think these are kind of highly trained legal professionals who run estates in the country. But what is characteristic of those people is that they are people like the Lestranges of Constantin. They are people who come from country estates, and they are coming to London or coming to Westminster as MPs to reform the abuses in the royal government. And they want to do that, and then they want to go home. But what's happened is that Parliament is now sitting, and it's still sitting, and it's sitting, and it's sitting, and it's sitting. And by November, it's already the longest sitting Parliament in English history. Already the longest Parliament. And where is it sitting? Well, it's sitting in the middle of Westminster, and Westminster is right next to London. And London at this point is a massively growing city. It's got 400,000 people. They all live in these kind of rookeries and seedy places like Southwark and Fulham. And as a result of that, these fundamentally quite conservative MPs are being faced with people like Catherine Chidley, ordinary people, giving off about religion, and they find it profoundly disturbing. Some of the stuff that Catherine Chidley says, and other people say, is it feels quite revolutionary. True ministers, she said, could be tailors, belt makers, button makers, tent makers, shepherds or ploughmen. And the implications of this really hit home with a group of sort of moderate MPs who were reformist in November 1640, but who by the end of the summer of 1641 were starting to think that things had gone too far. One of them was a guy called John Strangeways or Strangeways from Dorset. And he said in one of the debates, if we make a parity in the church, we must come to a parity in the Commonwealth. So the threat is that if we have this kind of sense of equality in the church, then the next thing we know, people will be wanting it in the Commonwealth, in the state, and then they'll be throwing down property and, all this kind of stuff. And so the press had an absolute field day with all these people. And that's where the title of this paper comes from. It's from a mocking pamphlet about some of the women who were allegedly meeting in London, people like Agnes Anabaptist, Kate Catabaptist, Frank Foot Baptist, Penelope Punk, Merrild Makebait, Ruth Rakehell, Tabitha Tattle, Prue Prattle, and that poor, silly, simple, senseless, sinless, shameless, naked wretch, Alice the Adamite. The Adamites were allegedly a group who went around naked, closer to God. I don't think there's any firm evidence that there were any people who did that. And it was the kind of this sort of conservative reaction to these people was perhaps best summarized by our old friend John Taylor, the water poet, his wonderful character. When women preach and cobblers pray, the fiends in hell make holiday. I love Taylor. Taylor's brilliant. And he's also responsible for one of the greatest literary spats in history, I think, between him and an independent called Henry Walker. And Henry Walker was an ironmonger by trade, but he became a pamphleteer and a newsmonger. He engaged in this kind of long-running spat with John Taylor about these sects. And it started with Taylor's wonderful "A Swarm of Sectaries and Schismatics," wherein is discovered the strange preaching or prating of such as are by their trades cobblers, tinklers, peddlers, weavers, sowgelders, and chimney sweepers. The horror. The famous image of the tub printer was used there. Samuel Howe is one of the most notorious. And another of Taylor's pamphlets is in the middle, where he shows Henry Walker coming out of the devil's arse, holding ironmongery there. So that's not a subtle image, and a not subtle image, one to which Walker responded by using the same image of the devil, but on this time sitting on John Taylor's face. You can see John Taylor here. He's in a water boat. So as a waterman, his job was carrying people across the Thames, and much like cabbies today, you tended to get quite a lot of opinions from the people carrying you across the Thames, and Taylor was absolutely kind of central to that. So, as I say, by late 1641, there is a kind of split in Parliament, and it's men like these. This is John Strangeways in the middle, and he another one of his sort of famous utterances was during the debates over the Grand Remonstrance, in which Pym was appealing to the people. Strangeways correctly said, "This is a remonstrance to the people. Remonstrances ought to be to the king for redress. We are not sent to please the people." A very honest view from an MP there, if you like. And most important of all was this man on the right, Edward Nicholas. From a sort of fairly kind of modest Wiltshire background, Nicholas became the kind of leading minister under Charles I in late 1641, and his task was to kind of put together a royalist party. And of course, famously, it was most evident in those debates over the Grand Remonstrance, where, and I used to be able to tell you exactly the number of votes, I think it was 159 to 142. So it's very, very close compared to the situation in November 1641. By November 1640, by November 1641, there are two sides. There are royalists. There can be a civil war. And the process whereby that kind of split in Parliament became a civil war sort of really kind of required one more piece of the puzzle, which was two geographical centres. And where that came from was another great moment whereby the politics of Westminster, the politics of great men, ran headlong into the politics of ordinary people. And it happened in December 1641. In December 1641, just after news had broken of the Irish Rebellion, the debates in Parliament were over how to send an army to quash that rebellion, and in particular, who would run it. The reformists around Pym, the so-called junto, didn't want to trust Charles I with being put in charge of an army because he couldn't be trusted. And Charles I didn't want to let his opponents get control of an army because that was a kind of, a fundamental part of his royal prerogative. And things, of course, came to a head in London in the what was described at the time as the maddest Christmas. This was one of those moments where Christmas really did play a crucial role in the English Revolution. And what happened was that Charles tried to put a man called Thomas Lunsford in charge of the Tower of London. Lunsford was someone who was ultra loyalist, hard drinking cavalier, and he'd already had to flee the country for murder. And he was quite happy to cultivate the reputation for cannibalism, kind of person he was. As a result of him being put in charge of the Tower of London, there were huge protests in London. This is a woodcut from the time. Colonel Lunsford assaulting the Londoners at Westminster Hall with a great rout of ruffianly cavaliers. And this is one of those occasions where a group of people had gone into Westminster Hall to protest. And Lunsford, who by this time had actually been fired by Charles, he only lasted 3 days, happened to be in Westminster Hall asking for money, drew his sword and ended up fighting. The next day, there was another mass protest outside Westminster Abbey, at which at one point a flagstone from the Abbey was thrown into the crowd and landed on the head of one Sir Richard Wiseman, who later died and became the sort of first martyr to the parliamentarian cause. Interestingly enough, around about this time, and I'm sure this was a coincidence, another of the great parliamentarian martyrs started to publicize himself as much as he possibly could, and that is this man, John Lilburn. In December 1641, his description of his trial in Star Chamber, and particularly the persecution that he suffered by the then Attorney General, Sir John Banks, who at this point was actually still right in the centre of the action, was published in December 1641 as an attempt by Lilburn to try and make sure that he was at the forefront of these kind of popular protests. In fact, it seems like people at the time recognized that Lilburn was there, he was fighting against Lunsford, but Wiseman was there as well. But the other thing that he did, the other thing that I like that he does do here is he makes sure that his image is there. And he was definitely someone who liked to have his face on documents. As a result of these protests, the bishops, who still sat in the House of Lords, including John Williams, put in a petition to Charles to say that Parliament was unfree because it was surrounded by people. And this finally angered the Lords into throwing the bishops in the Tower, meaning that the Royalist Party, which Edward Nicholas had been so assiduously building in Parliament, was in ruins. The only action left to Charles at this point was the notorious attempt to march into Parliament and seize 5 leading MPs the day after having indicted them or prosecuted them by his Attorney General, Edward Herbert. And this moment was seen by many at the time as the sort of the Rubicon moment of the Civil War. Charles had threatened violence against Parliament and there was no going back. Now, there were attempts to go back, but in fact, it wasn't so much that, but what happened next that was crucial. And I think that's that sort of nicely sort of end up my paper, because what happens next is that having gone to Parliament with an armed gang of about 500 blokes, all with pistols and swords, to try and pull out these 5 members by the ears, when the 5 then disappeared and went into London and hid in the City of London, protected by the citizens, Charles the next day decided to go and try and get them out again. But he did so in a much more peaceful way. He went by coach, and he went to the Guildhall, and he went to a special meeting of Common Council where he had some support. But as he came out of Common Council, he looked out in front of him, and there was a huge crowd of people all chanting, "Privileges of Parliament, privileges of Parliament." And he went to then go and have dinner with the sheriff. So he had dinner with one of the 2 sheriffs, and during that dinner, you could hear the crowd outside chanting, "Privileges of Parliament, privileges of Parliament." And then he came out of that meeting with the sheriff, and as he was trundling back home through the winding streets of the City of London, back towards towards Whitehall, someone ran up to his coach and threw in a pamphlet. And that pamphlet was entitled, "To Your Tents, O Israel." It was a biblical reference about a king who lost the support of his people. And who was the man throwing it into his coach? None other than Henry Walker himself, the ironmonger. And it was this incident that probably finally made Charles decide to take the momentous step of leaving London, leaving Whitehall, first going to Hampton Court, where famously he turned up so early that there were no beds and he had to share a bed with his family, and then into Windsor. And it's that moment that that basically you get these kind of two centers of gravity, if you like, two centers of gravity between the king and the Parliament. And it's a moment which is full of popular engagement in politics. And not only is that one of the factors which is pushing the political agenda, it's also something which royalists, which moderates find really troubling and problematic. And it's one of the reasons that they are able to get so much support. Okay, I'm going to finish off, but I'm going to just note quickly that this kind of courting of populism of the people is not something which necessarily the parliamentarians end up particularly comfortable with. And within a year of the Civil War starting in August 1643, there were large peace marches outside Westminster led by city women. And the parliamentary press were appalled by this. And they started to describe these women in similar kinds of terms that you might have seen from the royalist press in 1641. Oyster wives and other dirty and tattered sluts. Some say 500 of them were whores. These women were for the most part whores, bawds, oyster women, kitchen staff women, beggar women, and the very scum of the suburbs, besides abundance of Irish women. So this kind of awakening of the people became something problematic for the parliamentarians when they realized that lots of people didn't want to keep fighting this war. And by 1645, the Earl of Essex, this man here, is profoundly worried about this awakening. And again, one of these sort of, one of these kind of moments when suddenly the filter is off and he says what he really thinks. He's worried that Parliament is replacing the yoke of the king with the yoke of the common people. I am determined to devote my life to repressing the audacity of the people. Very nice thing for a leading aristocrat to say. And of course, that is partly at the heart of his conflict with Oliver Cromwell at this point, who around about the same point is very famously saying, I'd rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman, nothing else. Very similar words to those of Lady Felton at the start of this talk. But of course, even Cromwell by the end has decided that popular engagement in politics is a bit too much. And of course, in 1647-48, he was forced to fight down a leveller insurgency, which could have brought a much greater democracy. And one of the most kind of indicative speeches that Cromwell ever gives is when he opens the first Protectorate Parliament in 1654, I believe on the 3rd of November, 1654. So just 14 years to the day to the worst speech that Lucy Hay ever heard. Cromwell gave a speech in which he explicitly disavowed popular engagement in politics, levelling, and he supported the social order. Nobleman, gentleman, a yeoman. The distinction of these, that is a good interest of the nation. Great one. And I think one of the reasons that Cromwell is so successful in the 1650s, one of the reasons he dies in his bed, despite the fact that there are so many people out there who want to shoot him, is that he is able to finally play to that conservative gentry constituency who are worried about the explosion in perhaps even people like the Lestranges of Hunstanton, I suppose. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Another really paper that's really getting to grips with some of the detail of the evidence and fascinating new insights. We finished our trilogy of 17th century papers with a paper from Dr. Tessa Murdoch with comments from Dr. Dora Thornton, James II's Coronation Cup, the Coronation Procession, and the Barons of the St. Paul's. Please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Obviously, like Anna, I thought that this was going to happen yesterday, but it's today, and I'm in the right place. And I'm particularly thrilled to be joined by Dr. Dora Thornton from the Goldsmiths Company, who, in the time-honored tradition of this great institution, has brought things to show and tell. So I won't speak for too long. I'll hand over to Dora, who will explain what she's brought for you to examine closely. But I hope that this will re-engender a tradition of being able to admire objects at close hand. So this, of course, is a season of coronation, and it seemed appropriate to share with you the exciting opportunity to bring back to this country an extraordinary coronation cup. So the cup was connected with the coronation of King James II, so fast forward 40-some years. And I show you here this rather spectacular ivory celebration of James II's coronation, possibly by a Huguenot ivory carver working in London in the 1680s. Certainly one of that name takes shelter in the French hospital in the third decade of the 18th century. But here is the cup, which I spied at the one of the fairs of the armories in New York in 2008. It was with the dealers Koopman, and I'm delighted that Timo Koopman is with us this evening. And I know that he and his colleague Lewis Smith were particularly delighted to be able to sell the cup, which had been in the collection of Pierpont Morgan, back to this country. And of course, it was acquired with generous help from the Memorial Fund and the Art Fund, for which we are extremely grateful. So this cup and cover was made from recycled silver bells and stave mounts that adorned the canopies carried over James II and Mary of Modena at their coronation on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April, 1685. After the ceremony, traditionally, the silver was shared by the barons of the Cinque Ports, originally the 5 towns on the south coast, as a perquisite of their role in carrying the canopies over the king and queen in the coronation procession. 2 of these barons, members of the same family, probably father and son, Cresceld and Gordon Draper, combined their share, probably 1 stave mount and 1 bell, which were melted down to make this commemorative cup and cover. The combined weights of 1 mount and 1 bell were just under 36 ounces. And this cup and cover weighs just over 16 ounces. So it's possible that 2 cups were made, 1 for each member of the family who attended the coronation. Just to conjure up the scene, thanks to Francis Sandford. Intriguingly, the Royal Collections owns another silver cup, faced with chinoiserie figures. This one, unlike the V&A one, is actually marked with the sponsor's initials, TS crowned in a shaped shield, recently suggested by David Mitchell, and delighted David's with us this evening, as the mark of Thomas Smith, apprentice to one John Duck, who also produced silver flat chase, this is, with chinoiserie decoration. So you see that the body of this 2-handled cup on its shallow foot with scroll handles is similarly flat chased with chinoiserie seams. Here you can see one figure holding a parasol over another, surrounded by exotic birds and plants. Many of the motifs used in this and the V&A cup were drawn from Dutch prints, and especially the works of John Niehoff of the Dutch East India Company, whose account of his travels to China, an embassy from the East India Company of the United Province to the Grand Tartar Cham, Emperor of China, 1665, was first translated into English in 1669, and again republished in 1673. Further illustrations by Athenaeus Kircher were also popular in England and seem to be influential in the style of plants engraved and flat chased on silver of the period. The reverse of the Royal Collection cup is engraved in Latin, which translates loosely as "from the region which defends the king." It's likely that this cup also had a lid when it was first made, but it now weighs a little over 13.5 troy ounces, the remainder of the usual 16 ounces presumably made up by the now missing lid. This, commissioned by one of the barons of the Cinque Ports, we don't know which, a member of the Draper family or not, was appropriately acquired by King Edward VII when Prince of Wales. And you can see some of the evidence for its history and more details of the spectacular flat chasing on the sides of the cup. I know there's one theory that there was one specialist flat chaser in London who was responsible for this spectacular exotic form of decoration. So the V&A cup stands on a cast circular foot. The lower body is applied with cut cardwork, characteristic of foreign goldsmiths working in London and may possibly be Huguenot work. Here, a detail of the chinoiserie figures carrying the canopy. It's engraved with an escutcheon of arms, or on a fess between 3 amulet spools, as many covered cups. And the arms are flanked by 2 engraved cartouches inscribed with a Latin motto, which translates as, "I bear 3 cups." You can see the spaces between are engraved with branches. Notice the bird sitting on a branch just to the left of the coat of arms. And a panel below the coat contains another Latin inscription, which translates as, "I obtained this from the coronation of James II and Mary, April 23rd. So the coat of arms represents the Draper family of Winchelsea, which of course, as barons of the Cinque Ports, were barons only for the day of the coronation. And it records their role in supporting canopies over the king and queen. Although the cup and cover are typical for the form of this date, and the armorials and inscription are standard for the 1680s, I believe that the chinoiserie flat chase decoration, figures supporting the canopy, is of particular significance. Further research may indicate that the canopies used at James II's coronation were of cloth of gold woven in China. The fashion for chinoiserie decoration on contemporary silver extended to racing trophies, as here, the Basingstoke Monteith, 1688, which is in the V&A, and elaborate toilet service, such as the one from Sizer Castle, which was allegedly given to the family by Charles II, yet to be proven. But the maker TS, who marked the Royal Collection cup, also produced a pair of salvers with similar plants and birds with distinctive crests chased into the decoration. And here is one of these in the National Trust collection of Polesden laces. This taste for chinoiserie reflects the growing importance of European trade with China. And I also wonder if it reflects the Catholic influence through missionaries that brought back so much material evidence from the Far East. We heard about the new grant to the East India Company earlier this evening. And by the 1670s, the establishment of a trading base off Fujian resulted in large-scale shipments to England of admired Chinese goods. Such trade fostered the European market for furniture, japanned in imitation of true Oriental lacquer. Bed hangings and curtains of imported Chinese silk damask created appropriate settings for such exotic possessions. By 1688, John Stalker and Williams Parker's Treatise of Japanning and Varnishing was published to appeal to the growing taste for professional and amateur japanning. It was an extra you could take at school as a young lady. This manual was appropriately dedicated to Mary, Countess of Derby, Lady of the Bedchamber to the new Queen Mary II, daughter of James II and his first wife, Anne Hyde. Chinoiserie was an appropriately exotic visual language for furnishings associated with the monarch. Well, in 1685, the Jewel House delivery book records the delivery of the silver ornaments for the canopies. 3 days before the coronation of James II, the Benjamin Bathurst received 12 large canopy staves crowned with silver, 6 for His Majesty's and 6 for Her Majesty, weighing in all 369 ounces and 10 pennyweight. Bathurst also received 8 gilt bells for each canopy, with a combined weight of 61 ounces and 15 pennyweight. So from the coronation of Richard I, George IV, canopies were carried over the monarch by the barons of the Cinque Ports as a symbol of the role that the Cinque Ports played in defending king and country. The ports of Dover, Hastings, Hythe, Rumney, Sandwich, and later Winchelsea were granted privileges by the monarch in exchange for supplying ships and men to protect England's vulnerable southern coastline. As I've said, they enjoyed the title of the Baron for the day of the coronation only. Their presence ensured that leading citizens from the regions were represented on such national occasions to balance the presence of the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London and the aristocracy, who were then always well represented at such historic events. After the ceremony, the barons were entitled to claim the canopies of cloth of gold and silver bells and staves as perquisites of their role. They were also invited to dine at the table to the right of the King and Queen at the coronation banquet in Westminster Hall. But the division of perquisites were not always peaceful. At the coronation of Charles II in 1661, the royal footmen tried to tear the canopy and its bells from the barons during the coronation feast, and they dragged the barons away from their seats in Westminster Hall, as witnessed by Pepys and Bishop Kenneth. The canopy had also always been the perquisite of the barons, and Charles II had to dismiss the footmen, who were subsequently imprisoned. Other recorded examples of silver recycled from coronation bells and stave mounts include this tankard, made for the senior Baron Tobias Cleeve, who represented Sandwich, made after the coronation of Charles II, of which we'll hear more. There was a punch bowl and ladle by the London goldsmiths Boothby and William Fordham, made following George II's coronation, belonging to the Corporation of Hastings. Recycled silver from George III's coronation was allegedly refashioned as a chandelier for St Clement's Church, Hastings. This no longer survives. And there was also a basket from George III's perquisites. Well, Francis Sandford, Lancaster Herald, was appointed here the goldsmith tankard, which we will see in evidence shortly, and one of the bells surviving from Charles II's coronation, which is in the collections at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. So Francis Sandford, Lancaster Herald, was appointed by James II to publish an illustrated account of his coronation. The history of the coronation of the most high, most mighty, most excellent monarch, James II, and of his royal consort, Queen Mary, solemnized at Westminster, the 23rd of April, 1685, with an exact account of the several preparations, their Majesty's most splendid procession, and magnificent feast at Westminster Hall. This was published in 1687. And the enormous amount of work that went into life portraits of everybody who took part resulted in James II presenting Sandford with a cup and cover in recognition of his role in recording that event for posterity. And that too is in the collection of the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths. It incorporated medals from Mary of Modena and James II, which I think have subsequently been removed. It passed down the family and they needed to cash in the gold medals. And the account, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, gives very detailed identification of the processions. Many of those attending the coronation were, of course, Catholic subjects, as you would expect with the coronation of a Catholic monarch and his consort. There are other remarkable souvenirs from British coronations in the V&A and other museum collections. In 1975, the museum acquired this part of the canopy of Spitalfield silk, which was carried over King George II at his coronation in 1727. The rich gold brocade with lining of silver tabby and border of white lustring was supplied by the textile dealer George Binks, whose shop was in Covent Garden. Currently displayed in the V&A's British galleries, this rich fabric with its metallic colours was adorned by 4 silver gilt bells suspended from the corners. We know for George I's coronation, the London goldsmith Francis Garthorne supplied the bells, and one of these was subsequently bequeathed to the V&A by Sarah, Countess of Waldegrave in 1873, along with 2 further silver bells, which adorned the canopies held over King George III and King George IV. And I very much hope that Timo Koopman will be able to come up at this stage and ring one of the bells that was on the canopy at the coronation of George II. But of course, in this coronation season, you can hardly be surprised to hear that it's been sold, and the new owner was not prepared to join us tonight to ring the bell. One of the curiosities that was brought forward when we announced this acquisition at the V&A is a silver counterbox made out of one of the staves borne by the barons of Cinque-Ports at the coronation of George IV, as its internal inscription declared. And as a result of publicity around the acquisition, we were offered a copy of the coronation preached in Westminster Abbey at the coronation of James II. So although the James II Coronation Cup is normally displayed in the V&A's Whiteley Silver Galleries, and it is going to be taken off display for a select group of people to admire tomorrow morning. When it was hoped that in due course, a small touring exhibition of coronation silver could be arranged to be shown in museums in the Cinque-Ports, where Dover, Hastings, and Sandwich are well poised to receive such a display. So I would suggest we try and revive that and share these coronation trophies with the wider British nation. But it gives me great pleasure now to welcome my friend, Dora Thornton, who's going to explain a little bit more detail about the Charles II Cup. And it seemed appropriate to start that with the reminder of a monument to Thomas Dells in St. Clement's Church in Hastings, which claims that one of his most honoured days was when he served as a baron at the coronation of Charles II. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. Good evening. Can you hear me at the back? Good. So Tessa has told us about the coronation silver of James II, and I now invite you to take a step backwards to the coronation of Charles II in 1661. We will then end up by jumping neatly back into the present and looking at silver, which was specially commissioned by the Goldsmiths Company for the coronation of His Majesty just a few weeks ago. So it's a pleasure to share with you the tankard, which is up here at the front, made from perquisites or perk, acquired by the senior baron of the Cinque-Ports, Tobias Clear, who represented Sandwich at the coronation of Charles II. As a tankard, it's a very ordinary looking thing, but its interest lies in the engraved inscription around its body. This pot was made of the silver of the canopy when King Charles II was crowned, April the 23rd, 1661. Now, Tess has talked about the role of the canopy of James II as documented in Sandford's wonderful history of the coronation of 1687. And here you see a detail of the canopy held over the head of the Queen. The canopy held over the head of King Charles II is, as Tessa mentioned, described in Samuel Pepys's diary. He says, "And the king came in with his crown on and his sceptre in his hand, under a canopy borne up by 6 silver staves, carried by barons of the Cinque-Ports, and little bells at every end." And as Tessa mentioned, there was an unseemly scuffle, which Pepys witnessed as the king's footman tried to wrest the canopy from the barons, until order was restored at a sharp command from the king. The silver from the canopy was given as a perk to Tobias Clear, who was several times mayor of Sandwich, the senior baron of the Cinque-Ports, representing the port of the coronation. His ownership initials are pricked onto the thumb piece of the tankard, as you can see on the left. The maker's mark, identified by David Mitchell, is for Roger Stevens, who died in 1673 and had his workshop in Foster Lane, just down the road from Goldsmiths Hall. Again, Pepys mentions him as a maker several times in his diary. He made silver bosses for Pepys's Bible and communion plate of 1649 to 50, which still survives at the Church of St. Martin's in the Fields. The tankard passed by descent to Edward Clear, the son of Tobias Clear, and is mentioned in Edward's will of the 8th of October, 1687 in Canterbury. Now my father Tobias Clear did in his lifetime give and bequeath unto my son Tobias this house in Sandwich, tenement and appurtenances where I now dwell, also one large silver tanker, and so be it to him and his heirs forever. Edward's daughter Jane Clear married John Paramore, and it is their arms of Paramore impaling Clear which are engraved immediately beneath the inscription on the front of the tankard. It then passed to John Paramore's sister Jane Fuller, who married William Boys in 1762, and it is their arms, Boys impaling Fuller, which are engraved on the right-hand side of the tankard. The tankard was later acquired from their descendants by Anthony Littledale, who died in 1820, who had a taste for antique plate and had William Wyan, chief engraver at the Royal Mint, engrave his arms upon his purchases, as here, very beautifully. His descendant sold the tankard at Christie's on the 28th of February, 1923, and it was given to the Goldsmiths Company just a week later by Carrington Smith of Carrington & Co in Regent Street, of which he was a director, as a piece of great historic significance. But the Goldsmiths Company is not only linked to the coronation of Charles II, but also to the recent coronation of His Majesty Charles III through the medium of silver. The company led on a historic commission of a new processional cross, the Cross of Wales, by His Majesty the King, which celebrates the centenary of the church in Wales. The commission was led by Deputy Curator on my team, Francis Parton. The cross was blessed by the Archbishop of Wales in April and led the coronation procession at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May. You may have seen it on the television. It was commissioned from one of the foremost British silversmiths working today, Michael Lloyd, to show his signature skill of hand chasing, the closest thing to drawing directly on silver. And here you see the knotwork design based on 1,000 years of Welsh art and design rendered in a contemporary idiom. It's a very beautiful thing. I'm showing you the design drawing on the right and the actual cross on the left. In a special ecumenical spirit, the cross incorporates at its heart a relic of the true cross presented by Pope Francis to His Majesty the King for the coronation, and that lies behind the cabochon rock crystal at its center. And the text on the reverse, beautifully engraved, is taken from St. David's last sermon in Welsh: "Be joyful, keep the faith, do the little things." And here you see His Majesty applying his royal mark, the leopard's head, for the London Assay Office at the Goldsmiths Centre in November 2022. And the person in the background is Michael Lloyd, the maker, who watched over the whole thing with great interest and helpfulness. It's apparently the first time in history that the king has applied his own mark, king's mark, to a piece in silver. And we have kept the hammer and the punch as historic records of the event. And now literally a footnote to the coronation. The Goldsmiths Company also commissioned a pair of silver gilt buckles for presentation to King Charles III to wear for his coronation slippers. The buckles are closely modelled on the pair worn by the King's grandfather, George VI, at his coronation at the Abbey on the 12th of May, 1937, which are held in the Royal Collection. I'm showing you the original shoes here. These buckles are decorated with a neo-Georgian design of the Rose of England, the Shamrock of Ireland, and the Thistle of Scotland. And you can see them worn by George VI in this wonderful portrait by Sir Gerald Kelly in the Royal Collection. But the new buckles had to be larger and to be engineered to fit the form of the slippers on which they were to be worn. So it was quite an engineering job. So the designs were the buckles were designed by Clive Burr. They were digitally carved and printed in wax. They were then lost wax cast. They were then hand engraved and gilded by different specialists. And I'm showing you a detail of the hallmarks on the right, number 2 at the top, to show that this is the duplicate pair that we commissioned for the company collection obviously the number 1 went to His Majesty. And I can explain the marks because I brought the coronation buckles R1s from the company collection for you to see. And I do hope you'll come up and admire these wonderful pieces of silver at the end of this talk, if you can spare time before you go off and have your drinks. Small wares such as buckles have long been a feature of the Goldsmiths Company's related trades. Buckles actually appear on the arms of the company alongside tall cups in silver to show the range of its related trades. And I think the story of these 2 recent coronation commissions demonstrates the company's role in supporting contemporary makers in pursuit of excellent and artistry in precious metal. Thank you.
Thank you so very much indeed, Tessa and Dora. It's really nice to see objects being presented in this room, and particularly nice to see the combination of ancient objects and the contemporary crafts coming through. With your permission, rather than try and do a question and answer now for our speakers, I would suggest that people can have a look at the objects that have been very kindly brought in while we progress to reception afterwards. And I'd like to thank again our speakers for a very rich and sort of varied series of presentations that have really come to terms with what this society is all about, which is the past, the objects, their interpretation, and their relevance today, which I think shone through in all the papers. So I just need to announce that the next meeting of the Society will be on Thursday, the 5th of October, 2023, when we will hear a paper, Forging Iron from the Sky, by Ian Thackeray. The meeting stands adjourned, and drinks